Promised while still in childhood, she believed she could escape her own destiny, until she discovered that her freedom had already been negotiated years ago. Facing a marriage with a powerful and cold prince, she enters a world where luxury and tradition hide silent and dangerous rules. On the honeymoon night, what should have been the beginning of a nightmare takes an unexpected turn, and his indifference becomes even more disturbing than any approach. Trapped in a forced relationship, the two begin to wage a silent battle between pride, desire, and feelings that neither of them is prepared to face. Before diving into this intense story of love, power, and impossible choices, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any surprising reports. Nadia Khouri had learned since she was little that words were bridges. She grew up hearing Arabic in the kitchen, Portuguese on the street, and French in the classes her mother insisted on paying for, even in the tightest months. The daughter of a Lebanese family that had left Beirut 30 years earlier to start over in São Paulo, she had inherited 3 languages, a fierce stubbornness, and the certainty that she would need all of it to carve her own path in the world. At 25, she worked as a freelance interpreter and had built a solid enough reputation to be summoned, for the first time, to act at an international diplomatic conference in Paris. It was March. The city smelled of coffee and thin rain, and Nadia felt upon landing at Charles de Gaulle Airport, with her rolling suitcase and credential badge hanging around her neck, that she was finally taking the reins of her own life. The event took place at the Grand Palais des Congrès, one of those spaces that intimidate not by beauty, but by the heavy silence that inhabits every corridor. It was a conference on sustainable infrastructure investments, with delegations from more than 40 countries. Nadia had been allocated to the Arabic-Portuguese booth, responsible for facilitating dialogue with the delegation from the Emirate of Rashara, a small but influential Gulf country that had announced $1 billion fund for green projects in Latin America. It was technical, demanding work, and she had spent 2 weeks studying economic terminology in 3 languages so as not to make a mistake. But no preparation had warned her about him. Prince Khalid al-Rashid entered the plenary room with the calculated punctuality of someone who knows exactly the weight of his own presence. 32 years old, dark eyes that swept the room with the indifference of someone who had already seen everything the world had to offer. He wore Western attire under a white gutra, a detail Nadia noticed before noticing anything else, because it suggested a man accustomed to moving between worlds without completely belonging to any. He sat at the head of the delegation table and listened to the opening of the event with an expression bordering on overt boredom. Nadia was in the glass booth, headphones on, when the mediator asked the Rashara delegation to present their initial position. She began to interpret, and for a few minutes, everything went well. Then the prince's chief advisor said something in Gulf Arabic with an idiomatic expression that had no direct equivalent in Portuguese, and she chose a construction of her own, faithful to the meaning but different from the literal. The prince, who had only pretended not to pay attention, looked directly at the glass booth. After the session, in the corridor, he intercepted her. "You changed the words," he said in Arabic, without preamble. She stopped. She turned around slowly. "I interpreted the sense. There is a difference." He looked at her as if studying her with a curiosity that was not kindness. The correct interpretation would be another. "With all due respect," Nadia replied, maintaining a neutral tone with effort, "the correct interpretation is the one the listener understands. Words without meaning to the listener are not interpretation. They are noise." There was a brief, tense silence, the kind that carries more information than any sentence could contain. Khalid did not respond. He looked away, turned, and resumed his path with his advisors around him, as if the conversation had never happened. Nadia stood in the corridor for 3 seconds longer than she should have, her heart beating slightly above its normal rhythm, and then turned in the opposite direction. That night, in the modest hotel room the agency had reserved 4 subway stations away from the event, she called her mother. "It went well," she said. "Your voice sounds tense," said Soraya Khouri from across the ocean. "I'm tired. It's 8 hours in the booth." The mother made a pause that lasted too long. "Nadia, there is something we need to talk about when you get back," "Not now, Mother. I'm exhausted. It's not urgent, but it is important." She hung up without thinking much about the warning. There was a second session the next day, and she needed to sleep. But sleep took longer than expected. She lay looking at the ceiling of the small room, thinking about the prince's look in the corridor. There was no anger in it. There was something more irritating, the absolute certainty that he was right. That kind of calm conviction that some men cultivate from childhood, as if it were a birthright. On the second day, the prince did not seek her out, but Nadia noticed more than once that he was listening to the booth with a different attention than the day before. During the afternoon break, one of the advisors approached discreetly and said, in Arabic, that the prince had requested the interpreter's resume for the delegation's records. It was protocol, the advisor guaranteed, smiling without conviction. In the third and final session, when the conference reached its most technical point, a debate on contractual clauses with dense legal terminology, Nadia interpreted with a precision that left no room for dispute. At the end, when the microphones were turned off and the delegates stood up for the closing cocktail party, she left the booth and went straight to the buffet. She was hungry, she was tired, and she did not intend to stay a minute longer than necessary. It was then that he appeared beside her, without advisors this time. "Where are you from?" he asked in Portuguese with a heavy but understandable accent. She turned her head, surprised. "São Paulo," she replied, also in Portuguese. "Arabic family?" "Lebanese." He nodded slightly, as if the information confirmed something he already suspected. "My interpretation on the second day," Nadia said before he could continue, "was more precise than on the first. I hope you noticed." The corner of his mouth moved. It didn't quite reach a smile, but it was close. "I noticed," he said. And then he moved away, caught by a group of ambassadors waiting for him on the other side of the room. Nadia stood with the glass of water in her hand, looking at the empty space he had left, and had the uncomfortable feeling that this would not be the last time the two of them would meet. It wasn't romantic intuition. It was something more like a premonition, the kind that arrives before the questions, before any answer, and that doesn't ask permission to enter. 2 days later, she flew back to Brazil. 10 hours of flight, a book she couldn't finish, and her mother's warning coming back to her head like an unfinished sentence. "There is something we need to talk about when you get back." The tone had been too soft to be trivial, and too serious to be ignored. When the plane landed at Guarulhos and Nadia turned on her cell phone, there were 3 messages from her mother and 1 from her father, which was already unusual enough to tighten any stomach. She took a deep breath, picked up her suitcase from the belt, and went to the car, waiting for her. Outside, São Paulo smelled of wet asphalt and the life she had left 3 weeks before. But something had changed. She didn't know what yet. She only knew that the conversation waiting for her at home would not be simple, and that, for some reason she couldn't name, the face of the prince who had contested her interpretation in a Paris corridor remained present in her memory, with a clarity she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to dismiss. The Cury house was in a neighborhood in the ABC region of São Paulo, where the streets still had saints' names, and the sidewalks were wide enough to accommodate plastic chairs on Sunday afternoons. It was a corner house, with Portuguese tiles on the facade, and a fig tree in the backyard that Nadia's father had planted the first year they arrived in Brazil, as a promise of permanence. Nadia had grown up within those walls full of photographs in Arabic and diplomas in Portuguese, between the smell of za'atar and coffee, and she always knew that the house represented something more than an address. It represented the silent stubbornness of a family that had chosen to start over without forgetting where they came from. When she walked through the door that night, her parents were sitting at the kitchen table. It wasn't dinner time. The table was clean, no plates, no glasses, just a bottle of water, and 2 faces trying to look calm without completely succeeding. Nadia recognized that scene. It had happened before when her father's business went through a crisis, and before that, when her grandmother fell ill. It was the specific configuration of someone who needs to say something difficult and hasn't yet found the right word to start. She placed her suitcase in the hallway and sat down. "Tell me," she said. The father, Elias Cury, a man with white hair and the thick hands of someone who had worked his whole life importing fabrics from the Middle East, looked at his wife. Soraya nodded almost imperceptibly. He opened his hands on the table like someone exposing something they had carried for too long. "You know that our family has ancient ties with the Al-Rashid family," he began. "Khalid al-Rashid." The name flashed in Nadia's mind before her father finished the sentence, and she felt her stomach contract in a way she didn't immediately know how to name. "I know the surname," she said slowly. "I worked with their delegation in Paris this week." Elias closed his eyes for a second. "We knew that," said Soraya. "That's why your agency was recommended for the contract. The prince's father, Sheikh Mansour, personally asked that you be allocated to their booth." Nadia stayed quiet. The silence in the kitchen had the specific weight of revelations that have not yet ended. Elias spoke again, and now his voice had the heavy cadence of someone reciting something memorized because they know they won't be able to improvise. "When you were 3 years old, Nadia, Sheikh Mansour and I made an agreement. Our families have a history of decades, of trade, of mutual trust. He proposed a union. I accepted. It was another time, another mentality, and I believed it was the best I could do for the family and for you." Nadia heard the sentence to the end without interrupting. Then she heard the silence that came after. Then she heard her own heart, which had accelerated in a way that seemed disproportionate for a body sitting in a wooden chair in a kitchen in the ABC region. "You promised I would marry someone," she said, with a flat voice, with great care. "With Mansour's eldest son," said the father, "with Khalid." She stood up. It wasn't anger yet. It was the physical need not to be sitting at that moment. "I am 25 years old," she said. "I went to Paris to work. I went as a professional, as an interpreter, and the man I interpreted for, the man who contested my translation in a corridor, this man, since my childhood, is my fiancé, without anyone ever having told me this." Soraya stood up too and tried to reach for her daughter's arm. "We always thought it would be resolved before reaching here, that the agreement would be reviewed, that Sheikh Mansour would give it up. But he got in touch 2 months ago. The ceremony is being planned for the next semester." Nadia pushed the arm away gently, not with violence, because it wasn't her mother she wanted to confront. She walked to the kitchen window that overlooked the backyard. The fig tree was there in the dark, its wide leaves motionless in the still night. "And if I refuse?" she asked, still with her back turned. The father replied with a voice that had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "The agreement is linked to the commercial debts I contracted with the Al-Rashid family 8 years ago. If it is undone, the outstanding balances return with interest that I cannot afford to pay. We don't just lose the family's honor. We lose the house, the business, everything we built here." Nadia stood looking at the fig tree for a long time. She remembered her father planting that tree when she was 4 years old. She remembered him saying that the root of a fig tree is deeper than it looks, that it is what sustains everything that grows above the ground. She remembered believing him. She turned around. "I need a few days," she said. "Of course," said the mother. "But let it be clear," Nadia continued, with a firmness that surprised even herself, "that I haven't decided anything yet, and that any decision I make will be mine. Not the Sheikh's, not the prince's. Mine." She went up to her room without dinner. She lay on the bed without changing clothes. She stayed looking at the ceiling, and the first thing that came to mind was not a solution, not a plan, not even a coherent emotion. It was his voice in the corridor, direct, without beating around the bush, without the condescension she had expected and almost expected to confirm. "You changed the words," as if he actually knew the difference, as if, behind the arrogance, there was someone who paid attention. She closed her eyes and tried to transform this memory into something that made sense within what she had just discovered. She couldn't. They were two worlds that refused to fit. The man from the Paris corridor and the fiancé someone had chosen for her when she still wore ribbons in her hair and didn't know Paris existed. In the following days, Nadia functioned on autopilot. She went to appointments, answered emails, refused 2 new interpretation contracts without giving an explanation. She researched the Emirate of Rashara as if she were preparing a booth, with the same technical coldness she applied to work. She found articles about the country's accelerated development, about the social projects financed by the royal family, about Prince Khalid specifically, who had studied at Oxford and was pointed out as the most progressive face of the Al-Rashid generation. There was an interview with him in a European economics magazine. She read it twice. Not because the content was revealing, but because the voice in the interview sounded strangely similar to the one in the corridor. Direct, without unnecessary ornaments, like someone who had decided at some point in life that they had no time to waste on words that said nothing. On Thursday, the phone rang with an unknown number, international prefix. She answered without knowing why. "Miss Curry," said a voice in classical, formal Arabic. "Yes." "Prince Khalid Al-Rashid would like to speak with you. The prince is available to attend to you now, if you permit." There was a calculated pause, as if the choice of words were a royal courtesy, as if she could say no. She could have said no, but she didn't. Khalid Al-Rashid's voice was different over the phone, less heavy than in the Paris corridor, less molded by the physical presence he carried like a second skin. There was something almost neutral in it, like that of a man who had learned to control not only what he says, but how he sounds when saying it. "I heard your parents told you," he said in Arabic without preamble. I recognized the pattern, Nadia thought. He wasn't one for unnecessary introductions either. "I heard," she replied, also in Arabic, because it was the language the situation demanded. "And I presume you were also recently informed." 2 months ago, he confirmed. "My father called me and presented the agreement as if it were a novelty, but I suspect he had been planning this for much longer than he admits." She said nothing. She waited. "I do not agree with arranged marriages," said Khalid. "I want that to be clear from the start. It is not something I would have chosen for myself." "Then refuse," said Nadia, with an objectivity that surprised even her. There was a pause. "The situation for my family is more complex than a simple refusal," he said. "The agreement has political implications beyond the commercial ones. My father is using this as part of a strategy for regional alliances. If I refuse publicly, I weaken his position at a time when he cannot afford that luxury." "Then we are trapped," she said. "Not necessarily," Khalid replied, "but we would need to talk in person to discuss the possibilities. There are things that cannot be resolved over the phone." She observed her own reflection on the blank computer screen. A 25-year-old woman who had spent her entire life building autonomy word by word, language by language, and who was now having a call with a prince about a marriage no one had asked her to want. "Where?" she asked. "Roshara," he said. "Within 3 weeks. My father wants to make the formal announcement of the union. If you come, we will have time before the ceremony to talk and decide how we will conduct this. You are asking me to go to your country for a marriage neither of us wants. I'm asking you to come to my country so that we can decide together what to do with an agreement neither of us chose." The distinction was subtle but real, and Nadia recognized it because she had worked with subtle distinctions for years. He wasn't summoning her. He was proposing a conversation. It was little, but it was more than she had expected. "I'll think about it," she said. He didn't insist. He hung up after a brief farewell, and Nadia stood holding the phone for a while after the call ended, processing the strange weight of a conversation that had lasted less than 10 minutes and changed the geometry of everything ahead. She went to Roshara, not out of compliance, not out of weakness. She went because she had grown up hearing that words are bridges, and because a problem that is ignored does not disappear, it only finds a more difficult way to appear later. It was because her parents' house with the fig tree in the backyard could not be lost by a refusal she hadn't tried to negotiate first. And it was, although she didn't admit it to herself at that moment, because there was a question that Paris had left open, and she needed an answer. The plane landed in Roshara on an early May afternoon, when the sun had not yet reached its peak heat, but already announced what was to come. The delegation that received her at the airport was discreet and efficient. 2 advisors and an armored car with dark windows that took her directly to the Al-Rashid Palace, a construction that combined traditional architecture with modern finishes in a way that seemed organic, as if neither of the 2 styles needed to yield for the other to exist. Khalid was not at the entrance. Who received her was a woman in her 50s, with dark eyes and a measured smile, who introduced herself as Layla, head of palace protocol. She guided Nadia to her quarters with a gentle efficiency that left no room for questions, and explained that the prince would receive her in the inner garden at sunset. The quarters were too large for one person. Nadia unpacked her backpack, washed her face, and stood at the window looking at the garden she could see below. There was a fountain in the center, palm trees arranged in a semicircle, and flower beds she didn't know how to name, but that had a color between orange and red that seemed impossible at that time of day. Khalid arrived at the garden at 5 in the afternoon, with the punctuality she had already observed in Paris. No advisors this time. He wore a simple white dish dasha, different from the Western attire of the conference, and there was in this change something that Nadia noticed without knowing exactly what to do with the observation. They greeted each other with the natural formality of two strangers who share an absurd situation and have not yet found the right register to deal with it. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I still don't know if it was the right decision," she replied. "That honesty is more useful than courtesy," he said, and sat in one of the stone chairs beside the fountain. She sat in the chair opposite. They talked for almost 2 hours. It wasn't a romantic conversation. It was a negotiation between two adults who needed to understand the terrain before taking any step. Khalid explained the political pressures his father faced, the regional agreements that depended on the stability of the royal family, the fragility of a moment when any gesture of internal weakness could be used as leverage by external forces. Nadia listened carefully and then spoke about her own situation with the same precision she would apply to an interpretation booth. Her father's debts, what the family would lose, what she herself would lose, and what it meant for a woman who had built her own independence to have that independence negotiated before she even knew it existed. Khalid listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was silent for a moment before speaking. "I have a proposal," he said, "a formal marriage, which satisfies the obligations of both families and protects my father's political interests. But between us, a different agreement. You will have total freedom within the palace. You will continue your interpretation work remotely, and neither of us will be forced into anything beyond what the formal situation requires. In time, when the political moment is stable, we can seek an honorable way out for both." She looked at him. She searched his dark eyes for some trap, some layer that hadn't been said. She found none, which in itself was information. "And if I don't agree with the terms during the process?" she asked. "Then you leave," he said, "without consequences for your family. I will find another way to deal with your father's debts." "Why would you do that?" Khalid looked at the fountain for a moment before answering. "Because I grew up in a system that uses people as pieces, and I decided at some point that I don't want to be the kind of man who perpetuates that." Sunset had arrived while they talked, and the garden was now tinged with orange. Nadia stood looking at him for a long second, weighing the words she had heard, weighing the silence that came after them, weighing everything between Paris and that garden and her parents' kitchen window with the fig tree outside. Then she said, with the firm voice of someone who has made a decision that will still cost a lot before making sense, "All right, I accept the terms, but I want them recorded in writing, with witnesses, before any ceremony. I don't sign a blank agreement." Khalid's mouth moved the same way it had moved in the Paris corridor. It didn't quite reach a smile, but it was closer this time. "Fair," he said. The ceremony took place on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after Nadia had arrived in Rashara, in a palace hall that held 500 people and was occupied by all of them. There were white flowers from floor to ceiling, musicians in every corner, and delegations from countries Nadia could barely locate on a map. Her mother and father traveled from São Paulo 2 days before and arrived with a mixture of guilt and relief that Nadia didn't know how to interpret, so she chose not to try. She hugged them both at the airport, said she was fine, and kept the rest for later, for a moment that perhaps would never come, or that would arrive so late it no longer hurt the same way. She wore the outfit that had been prepared by a court designer, a piece between the traditional and the contemporary, with gold embroidery on ivory fabric, which balanced the two worlds without betraying either. When she looked at herself in the mirror before going down to the hall, She stood still for a second longer than she should have. She wasn't unrecognizable, but there was something different about the woman looking back at her. A seriousness in her eyes that wasn't new, but was more visible than before, like when you adjust the focus of a camera, and what was always there suddenly appears clearly. Khalid was standing at the back of the hall when she entered. He wore ceremonial white with gold details that mirrored the embroidery of her outfit, and Nadia realized, without having planned to realize, that someone had coordinated this with care. He looked at her as she approached with an expression that was hard to read, not cold, not warm, something in the middle that seemed like calculated reserve. She did the same, and together they performed the rite with a dignity that would deceive any external observer. The contract Nadia had demanded was signed and kept with her lawyer in São Paulo, a copy with witnesses in Arabic and Portuguese describing the terms of the private agreement between them. There was something almost absurd about the existence of that document. A contract within a marriage, an agreement to delineate the limits of a union that was itself a limit. But it was what she had asked for, and he had complied. And there was in that, she recognized, a form of respect she hadn't expected to find. The honeymoon was in Dubrovnik, a choice that sounded neutral enough for both sides, a city between the sea and the stone, where neither of them had history nor belonged to anyone. The hotel was an old restored property on the walls, with windows overlooking the Adriatic, and a silence that, after the noise of the ceremony, sounded almost violent. In the first room in Dubrovnik, Nadia prepared for the worst version of what could happen. She had grown up hearing stories about what arranged marriages demand of women on the night after the ceremony, stories told in low voices between aunts in the kitchen, stories that taught fear without naming the fear clearly. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, waiting. Khalid entered the room, closed the door, and stood on the other side, looking at her. Then he went to the bathroom, returned with a small steel knife that was part of the hotel's first aid kit, and without saying a word, made a small cut on the palm of his own hand. He left a few drops of blood on the sheet. Then he took a bandage, covered the cut with clinical efficiency, and said, looking directly at her, "Now there is proof for whoever needs one. You owe me nothing." Nadia stood looking at him for a long time. Not for the first time that week. He had done something she didn't expect. And it wasn't the magnitude of the gesture. It was the direct way, without drama, with which it had been done. As if it were the obvious thing to do. As if the alternative hadn't even crossed his mind. "Why did you do that?" she asked, with a very quiet voice. "Because you didn't choose to be here," he said. "And because the fact that you didn't choose doesn't give me any right over you." He went to the sofa in the corner of the room, lay down in the clothes he was wearing, and said good night with the same naturalness with which he had said everything else. In a few minutes, by his breathing, she realized he had fallen asleep. She stayed awake for much longer, looking at the ceiling of the hotel room in Dubrovnik, listening to the sea outside, trying to organize into a logical system what had happened in the last 10 days of her own life. She couldn't. There were too many variables, and some of them had the face of a man who had disappointed her in a strange way, by not being who she had prepared to face. Back in Rashara, the life that established itself between the two had the silent quality of a tacit agreement fulfilled with discipline. Khalid left early, returned late, and when their paths crossed in the palace corridors or at the formal meals that palace etiquette required, there was between them a functional courtesy that was not coldness and was not affection. It was what they had agreed upon. Nadia had set up an office in the workroom designated for her and resumed her interpretation contracts remotely. The time zone was different, but the work was the same, and there was a comforting stability in continuing to be, even within that enormous palace, the woman she had decided to be. What she hadn't foreseen were the small fissures. The first happened on a Thursday afternoon, when she went out for a walk in the gardens and found Khalid sitting on a stone bench, alone, with a tablet in his hand and 3 children around him, children of palace employees who apparently frequented that space regularly. He hadn't realized she was watching. He was showing something on the screen to the children, some educational program, and there was in his posture a lightness she had never seen before, as if the armors he carried in all other contexts simply didn't apply there. She stood still for a moment longer than she should have before continuing her walk. The second fissure was during a formal dinner with ambassadors, when one of the guests made a veiled comment about female competence in diplomatic contexts. And Khalid, without raising his voice, dismantled the guest's argument with 3 sentences so precise that the entire table fell silent. He didn't look at Nadia afterward. He didn't seek approval. He just resumed the conversation as if nothing had happened. But she had seen it, and there was something in the fact of having seen it that she still didn't know how to classify. The third was a conversation that happened by accident, on an afternoon when she was working in the office, and he entered without realizing she was there, talking on the phone about a literacy project in remote villages of the Emirate, discussing budgets and schedules with an urgency that was not of protocol. When he realized she was there, he stopped for a fraction of a second. Then he continued the call without ceremony, finished the subject, and upon hanging up said, almost to himself, "Sorry for the interruption." "It wasn't an interruption," she said. "It was interesting." He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her with that expression she still hadn't managed to completely decipher. "It's a project that my father doesn't support," he said. "He thinks it's idealism without political return. And you continue anyway. Some things matter more than political return." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was the longest look they had exchanged since Dubrovnik, and there was in it a quality different from everything that had come before. Not confrontation, not negotiation, something closer to recognition. Then he nodded briefly, left the room, and Nadia stayed looking at the open document on the computer screen for a long time without reading a single word. July arrived in Rashara with the heat that Nadia had learned to respect. It wasn't the humid heat of São Paulo which embraces and suffocates. It was a dry heat with defined edges that doesn't apologize and doesn't negotiate. There was something honest in it that she had begun to appreciate in the same way she appreciated people who say exactly what they think, without unnecessary ornaments. She had lived in the Al Rashid Palace for 2 months. 2 months of wide corridors and functional silences and formal dinners and remote work that kept her connected to the world she had left in São Paulo. She had found a routine. It wasn't the routine she had imagined for herself, but it was a routine she herself had molded within the conditions that existed, and that, she discovered, was more important than the routine itself. The relationship with Khalid had settled into a territory that had no clear name. They weren't strangers, but they also weren't what any conventional word could describe. They talked, sometimes at length, about the literacy project he conducted, about the contracts she interpreted, about politics and languages, and about the different ways in which 2 cultures can solve the same problem. There was mutual respect, and there was something growing beneath the respect, quieter, more insistent, that neither of them had yet named because naming would seem premature, and both, for different reasons, had learned not to be premature. What broke the balance was Yasmin. Yasmin Al-Fard arrived at the palace on a visit that protocol described as diplomatic courtesy, but that the gaze of Layla, the head of protocol, described as something more complicated. She was 30 years old, the daughter of a family allied with the Al-Rashids, and there was between her and Khalid a history that Nadia noticed before anyone needed to explain. Not because there were obvious gestures, but because there was a familiarity between the two that has the specific texture of a shared past. That way of completing sentences before the end, that silence that doesn't need to be filled. Nadia observed the reception dinner with the same clinical attention with which she observed negotiations in glass booths. There was nothing improper. But there was something real, and the real is usually harder to ignore than the improper. That night in her room, she stood before the mirror for a very long time and tried to identify precisely what she was feeling. Was it jealousy? She had no right to jealousy. They were strangers in a manufactured situation. Was it indignation? The agreement had been clear. Was it fear? Fear of what exactly? And then, with the honesty that only appears when there is no one else around to contradict, she admitted to herself that what she felt was simpler and more complicated than any of those words. There was something that had begun to grow inside her throughout those weeks, something that had been planted in the Paris corridor, and watered without her realizing by every conversation in the garden, every dinner where he defended what he believed, every afternoon where he appeared carrying projects that his own father despised, and this something had no name she wanted to give it yet. But it was there, and Yasmin's presence had illuminated its existence with a clarity she hadn't asked for. 2 days later, she crossed paths with Khalid in the West Wing corridor, and he noticed immediately that there was something different. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, which was the easiest answer. He stood still. He didn't accept the easiest answer. "Yasmin and I had a history," he said without her having asked. 4 years ago. It ended because our families had other plans for each of us. It was one of the few things in my life over which I had no control." Nadia looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you observed the dinner with the same expression you use when you are processing information you didn't ask to receive. And because I think you deserve context." She was quiet for a moment. "You pay a lot of attention," she said. "It's my job," he replied. "I've led negotiations since I was 22. Learning to read a room is more necessary than any protocol." "And what did you read in me at that dinner?" He looked at her directly. There was in the words that followed an honesty that was not calculated. That was just the kind of thing that appears when two people have stopped pretending they are not paying attention to each other. "I saw a woman who had begun to care about something she hadn't planned to care about," he said, "and who became uncomfortable with that." The corridor was empty. Outside, the July heat pressed against the windows. Nadia felt the impulse to retreat, to convert that moment into something safer, more controlled. But she had spent her whole life building bridges, and there was something she recognized when two people finally needed to cross one. "You are not wrong," she said. Khalid stood still for a second. Then he nodded slowly, like someone who heard an answer they didn't know they were waiting for. "Yasmin leaves tomorrow," he said. "And the situation between the two of us, Nadia, is not what I would like it to be, but I don't know what you want it to be." She didn't know either, but knowing that he was asking was enough for now. In the following days, something changed in the geometry of the coexistence. Not in a dramatic way, without large gestures or declarations, but the space between the two became smaller, and the silence that before had been empty became the kind of silence found between people who don't need to fill the air to feel in the same room. They began to have dinner together without etiquette demanding it. He started asking about the interpretation contracts with real, not protocolary interest. She started accompanying him on some visits to the literacy project, not as an observer, but translating in the villages where the local dialect was more closed and he needed a bridge. There was in these moments of joint work a complicity that neither of them had sought and that neither of them tried to avoid anymore. But there was also the shadow of the agreement they had signed, the promise of an honorable exit when the political moment was stable. And there was Sheikh Mansour, who had begun to summon Khalid for more frequent meetings, and who, when crossing paths with Nadia in the corridors, looked at her with the satisfied expression of someone who believes a plan is working exactly as it was designed. Nadia didn't like being the well-positioned piece on anyone's board. And it was this feeling, more than anything else, that made her begin to research with discretion, in the early hours when the palace slept, the exact conditions of the commercial agreement between the families. She needed to understand the terrain before deciding anything. She had learned this from years of working in glass booths: never speak without knowing the full context, never take a position without having verified all the words. What she found in that research kept her awake until dawn. And when the July sun began to lighten the sky over Rashara, she knew there was information that changed everything, and that she needed to decide what to do with it before anyone else discovered it first. What Nadia had found in the late-night research was not a betrayal in the sense that soap operas construct, with hidden letters and deliberate lies. It was something more nuanced, and for that very reason, harder to resolve. Upon tracing the commercial records of her father's fabric import business with the Al-Rashid family, she had found documents indicating something no one had told her. The debts her father believed he owed to Sheikh Mansour had been settled 8 years ago, in a renegotiation operation that Mansour himself had conducted. Completely settled. The argument that refusing the marriage would destroy the family financially was false. It had been false from the beginning. She spent 2 hours organizing the documents on the computer, verifying dates, comparing records. There was no margin for error of interpretation. The debt no longer existed. What existed was the narrative of the debt, kept intact because it was the most efficient instrument of pressure 2 families had found to ensure that an agreement, made 30 years earlier, was fulfilled at the moment they needed. The question was, did Khalid know? She looked at that question for a long time before being ready to do anything with it. There were 2 possibilities. In the first, he had participated from the beginning in maintaining the false narrative, which meant that everything, the garden in Rashara, the conversations about the literacy project, the night in Dubrovnik, had been part of a strategy. In the second, he had also been kept in the dark by his own father, which meant they were both, each in their own way, pieces on Mansour's board. Neither of the possibilities made the situation simple, but there was a huge difference between them. She spent the following day in a state of artificial calm that she had to sustain with effort. She had a 3-hour remote interpretation session, prepared reports, answered emails. In the afternoon, when Khalid returned from a meeting at the ministry, she found him in the garden and said with the voice of someone about to cross a bridge without knowing if the other side has firm ground, "I need to show you something." They sat at the same stone table beside the fountain where the first real conversation between them had happened, and Nadia opened the computer and showed the documents. She said nothing while he read. She let the information arrive on its own. Khalid read in silence. She observed his face during the reading with all the attention she had developed in years of work, interpreting not just words, but expressions, pauses, the way a person's body responds to what the mind is processing. What she saw was not dissimulation. It was genuine shock, followed by a cold anger that he controlled but could not completely hide. When he finished, he closed the computer with excessive care that betrayed how much he was holding back. "You thought I knew," he said. It wasn't a question. "I considered the possibility," she said, because she was honest. "And now? Now I showed you the documents before doing anything with them. That should answer your question." He stood looking at the fountain for a while. The water ran with the perfect indifference of things that do not know there are human stories falling apart and remaking themselves around them. "My father," he said slowly, "is a man who believes that the end justifies the means when the end is the stability of the family. I fundamentally disagree with that, and apparently he knew I would disagree, so he never told me." "That means you didn't choose to be here the same way I didn't choose," she said. "It means we were both manipulated with different arguments, but with the same objective. He trapped you with your father's debt. He trapped me with political pressure. And both were instruments, not immutable facts." Nadia closed the computer. "Then we are free," she said. "Technically." "Technically," he repeated, with a specific weight on that word that she understood immediately, because technically didn't simply mean easily. There was the formal announcement already made. There were the families. There was Sheikh Mansour. There was the literacy project that depended on funding that Khalid's political position guaranteed. There was, and she recognized this now with a clarity she hadn't asked for, what had grown between the two in the last few weeks, which was also real and also complicated any simple answer. "Are you going to confront your father?" she asked. "I am," he said, "not because the marriage is invalid, but because I need him to understand that he cannot use people as variables in an equation without consequences." "And after the confrontation?" "After," said Khalid, and now he looked at her with that expression she had learned to recognize as the moment when he said something that was not protected by any armor. "What happens between us needs to be your choice, no one else's." She looked at him. "You are giving me the choice back again. It was always yours. I just want to make sure you know that." Khalid's meeting with Sheikh Mansour happened the next day, behind closed doors, in the wing of the palace that protocol reserved for conversations that shouldn't be heard in the corridors. Nadia was not present. She stayed in the office trying to work and succeeding only in part. Layla passed through the door once, looked at her with that measured smile she had learned to read, as a sign that the head of protocol knew more than she appeared to. 2 hours later, Khalid returned. He entered the office without knocking and sat in the chair in front of Nadia's desk, as if he were exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. "How was it?" she asked. "He didn't deny it," said Khalid. "He said he did what was necessary to ensure the future of the family. He said I should be grateful." "And you?" "I said he had made a decision for me that was not his to make, and that regardless of what happens from now on, I would never again accept being moved on the board without consent." She heard that and was silent for a moment. Then she said, with a very quiet voice, "That took courage." "It wasn't courage," he said. "It was necessity. There are things that, if you don't say them, stay inside you and rot." She recognized that. There were things like that inside her too, things she had carried in silence because the family needed it, because it was easier, because the moment was never right. There was a specific fatigue in that kind of silence that she had learned to live with without realizing she was learning it. "My father wants us to continue," said Khalid. "To him, the marriage remains valid and the terms haven't changed, but I said that depended on you, and only on you." She looked at him. At the man who had contested her interpretation in a corridor in Paris, at the man who had slept on a sofa in Dubrovnik without her having to ask, at the man who conducted literacy projects in villages while his own father thought it was useless idealism, at the man who had placed in her arms the choice that someone had tried to take from her before she even knew it existed. She didn't answer at that moment. She said she needed a night to think. And he nodded, because he was the kind of man who knew that certain answers are not rushed. Nadia didn't sleep. She stayed awake with the window open to the palace garden, listening to the warm July wind move the palm leaves, and organized within herself what had accumulated without asking permission over those 2 months. It wasn't a sentimental exercise. It was the same process she applied to work, putting each element in its exact place, seeing the whole clearly before building any translation. The facts were these. She had been led to the marriage by false arguments. Khalid had been too. Sheikh Mansour had orchestrated the process with the coldness of an administrator who doesn't distinguish people from assets. She had the complete right to end that marriage, return to São Paulo, resume the life she had built before Paris. There were documents that supported each of these points. There was a lawyer in São Paulo who could initiate the contract dissolution process. And there was Khalid, not as an obstacle, not as an argument, but as an independent fact that existed on its own, separate from all the others. A man who had learned, at some point she hadn't witnessed but recognized in the effects, that respecting someone meant giving that person back the power to decide. A man who had demonstrated this not in words, but in actions, repeatedly from Dubrovnik to the previous afternoon in the office. A man who had confronted his own father for her, not to maintain the marriage, but so that any choice she made would be genuinely hers. And there was herself, what she had become in those 2 months inside that palace, not diminished as she had feared, but expanded in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had continued her work. She had learned a new dialect in the villages. She had begun to understand the political structure of a small country, with a way of existing very different from her own, and had found in that difference not alienation, but curiosity. She had found in the man she lived with not a master, not an adversary, but something the languages she knew didn't have a single word to describe, an equal who was completely different from her. When the sun began to color the sky over Rashara, she made the decision. It wasn't dramatic. It was the logical continuation of everything she had thought, the sentence that closes a paragraph that had been built word by word over months. She went to Khalid's room early before the formal breakfast and knocked on the door. He opened in a few seconds, like someone who also hadn't slept. "I've made a decision," she said. He waited without haste. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I am forced to, not because of your father or mine, because I choose it, and I want you to know the difference." Khalid stood still for a moment. There was in his eyes something she hadn't seen before, not the calculated reserve, not the clinical attention, but something more vulnerable and more honest than any of those things. "I know the difference," he said, "and I also choose." It wasn't a hug. It wasn't a kiss. It was a look that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and then the two went to have breakfast together, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, because for them, that morning, it was. The problem was that Sheikh Mansour hadn't finished. 3 days later, Nadia was summoned by Layla to a meeting in the formal reception wing of the palace. When she arrived, she found not only Layla, but the Sheikh himself, sitting with the posture of someone who believes the space around him belongs to him. Beside him was a legal advisor Nadia hadn't seen before. The Sheikh received her with the surface cordiality that powerful people use when they are about to present something as a favor when it is actually an imposition. "Nadia," he said in Arabic, with the paternal tone she had learned to distrust, "I am happy that you have decided to stay. This demonstrates maturity and understanding of what really matters for a family." She sat down. She crossed her hands on her lap. She waited. "As you are adapting well," the Sheikh continued, "I thought it would be the right time for us to talk about your formal participation in the family's public representations. There are events in the next semester for which your presence would be strategically valuable. I would also like to discuss the termination of your independent interpretation work, since the family representation obligations will require exclusive dedication." She listened to the end. Then she spoke with the quiet and firm voice she used when what was being said needed to be heard without ambiguity. "Sheikh Mansour," she said, "I respect what you have built for your family, and I understand the value that tradition has in this context. But I need it to be clear. My choice to stay here was made by me, based on what I want for my life. It is not a sign that I accept being repositioned. My work continues. My presence at public events will be decided by me in consultation with Khalid on a case-by-case basis. I don't sign blank agreements, and that principle hasn't changed." The legal advisor looked at the Sheikh. The Sheikh looked at Nadia. There was a silence in the room that was different from the silences she had learned to navigate in that palace. It was more tense, more evaluative. Then the door to the room opened and Khalid entered. By his expression, he had been informed of the meeting. By the way he positioned his body beside Nadia before any word, it became clear which side he was on. "Father," said Khalid, "Nadia has already explained to me what was discussed here. I would like us to make it clear that decisions about her life and about our life as a couple will be made between us, not in meetings to which she was not invited with enough advance notice to prepare." The Sheikh looked at his son for a long moment. There was something in that look that Nadia recognized. It wasn't anger. It was the evaluation of a man who was recalibrating an equation he had calculated wrong. "I understand," said the Sheikh at last, with a voice that was more contained than anything she had heard from him before. The meeting ended without a dramatic resolution, but Nadia, leaving the room beside Khalid, felt that something had changed in the structure of that palace, not in a visible way, not in a way that appeared in any protocol. But there was a line that had been drawn, and the two most important people in the room had chosen to be on the same side of it. In the corridor, without anyone listening, Khalid said in a low voice, "You didn't need to wait for me." "I didn't wait for you," she said. "I was already finishing. You arrived at the right time, but it wasn't necessary." He turned his face to her, with that expression bordering on a smile. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I came." She understood what he was saying. He hadn't arrived to save her. He had arrived to be beside her. There was a difference. And both of them, through the entire trajectory that had brought them to that corridor, knew exactly what it was. August arrived in Rashara, and with it a change in temperature that was not only climatic. The heat had reached its peak and begun to yield, as happens with all things that reach a limit and then find a different balance from what existed before. Nadia had learned to measure time in that country, not by the calendar but by these subtle variations, the direction of the wind at sunset, the angle of light on the garden stones, the rhythm with which the palms moved their leaves. It was a way of inhabiting a place she hadn't planned to develop, but that had arrived naturally, as things that stay arrive. 3 weeks had passed since the meeting with Sheikh Mansour. The palace had found a new balance. less tense, more honest. Mansour had retreated, not in an overt way, but in the practical ways that matter. The suggestions about exclusive representations had ceased, the meetings without prior notice as well. Layla, who had observed everything with her measured smile, had told Nadia one afternoon that she admired her. It wasn't a protocol compliment. It was the kind of statement a woman who spent decades navigating power structures recognizes in another. The literacy project had received approval for expansion to 3 more villages, a victory that Khalid had celebrated with the typical restraint of someone who is not used to celebrating their own achievements, but that Nadia had learned to recognize in small signs. The unusual lightness in his step, the moment the armor yields for a few minutes, without him realizing it yielded. On an August afternoon, they went together to one of the villages for a meeting with the families who would participate in the program. It was a place 2 hours by car from Rashara, with stone houses and roads that modernity had not yet completely reached. The children of the village looked at Khalid with the familiarity of someone who had seen him before, and looked at Nadia with the gentle curiosity reserved for the new. She had talked with the older women in a mixture of classical Arabic and local dialect she had learned in bits and pieces in the previous weeks, and there was something in the way they received her, with seriousness, with real interest, that was different from anything she had experienced within the palace walls. On the way back in the car, the silence between her and Khalid was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The landscape passed by outside, sand and stone, and the sky that began to gain the colors of sunset. "You are good at this," said Khalid, without looking away from the road. "At what?" "At making people feel they are truly being heard." "It's what an interpreter does," she said. "No," he said, "an interpreter transmits words. What you do is different. You transmit what exists below the words." She stood looking at him for a moment. There was in that observation something that hit her in a way she hadn't anticipated, because it was a way of being seen that went beyond what any professional qualification would describe. "You do that too," she said. "Only you call it negotiation." His mouth moved. This time it reached a real smile, not the controlled half-smile she had learned to decipher over the months, but something more open, more real, that lasted only a few seconds before he went back to looking at the road. But there was something that was still pending, and Nadia knew it needed to be resolved before anything else could be built on top. It was the revelation of the documents, the question of the non-existent debt, and what she had decided to do with it in relation to her own family. She had called her parents the previous week. She had said what she had found, with all the precision that love demands when it needs to be honest. She had heard her father's silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that carries decades. And she had said after a moment, "I'm not angry with you. I understand you believed you were protecting the family, but I needed you to know the truth." The father had replied with the voice of someone who is carrying something too heavy for too long, and finally found where to set it down. "I'm sorry, Nadia. I'm sorry for having made a decision that was yours without asking you." They were the words she had needed to hear, not to absolve, but to rebuild from a more honest point. When the car arrived back at the palace and they got out in the inner courtyard, the sun had almost disappeared and the garden lanterns were lit. Khalid stood in the courtyard for a moment, looking at the palace he had inherited, as if he saw it from a slightly different angle. Nadia stood beside him, looking in the same direction. "What do you want this to be?" he asked. She knew that this wasn't the palace, it was everything. She thought for a moment, not in the sense of someone searching for an answer, but in the sense of someone who wants to be sure they are saying exactly what they want to say. "I want it to be real," she said, "not protocol, not an agreement, not political strategy. I want what exists here to be genuine or to be nothing." "And if it's genuine and difficult at the same time," he said. "Then it will be genuine and difficult," she said. "That doesn't scare me." Khalid looked at her, and there was in that look everything that had been built over months of conversations and silences and confrontations and choices. The Paris corridor, the garden on the first afternoon, Dubrovnik, the villages, the office, the corridor after the meeting with his father. There was all of that, compressed into a look that lasted only a few seconds, but that contained much more time than that. Then he said, with the simplicity that is the most demanding way of saying anything important. It doesn't scare me either. They didn't need more than that. They entered the palace together, each carrying the entire world they had come from, and neither asking the other to abandon theirs to inhabit the other's. There was in this a form of love that didn't have the name that stories usually use, but that was real exactly for that reason, because it didn't depend on a word to exist. And it was in the corridor that Nadia had the revelation that had arrived without warning, as things that have been under construction for a long time arrive before becoming visible. That palace in Rashara had become, without her having planned it, the place where for the first time in her life she had been completely seen by another person. Not the interpreter, not the obedient daughter, not the piece on the board. Her, Nadia Khoury, with all the languages and all the stubbornness and all the fears she had carried through the 25 years of her own life. And she realized there was a difference between being free to leave and wanting to stay. It wasn't the same thing. It never had been. And now that she knew both, she knew exactly which of the two she had chosen. September arrived in Rashara with a breeze that was not yet cold, but had already forgotten the weight of summer. Nadia was in the inner garden when the phone rang with the number of her agency in Sao Paulo. It was a new contract, an African Union conference in Addis Ababa, simultaneous interpretation in Arabic, French and Portuguese, 15 days, starting in October. The coordinator asked if she had availability. Nadia stood for a moment with the phone in her hand, looking at the fountain at the center of the garden. Then she said, "Yes, I have availability. Send me the briefing." When she hung up, Khalid was sitting on the stone bench beside her. He had returned earlier from the ministry, and she hadn't realized when he arrived. He was looking at her with that attention she had learned to recognize, not as surveillance, but as real presence, the kind of attention that doesn't need to be declared to be felt. "Addis Ababa?" he said. "In October, 15 days. He nodded. "I'll take the literacy project for review in that period. It will be a busy month." That was how it worked between them now. Not fusion, not dependency. Two lives that had found a way to move together without either needing to stop being what it was. It had taken time to get here. It had taken difficult conversations and documents found in the early hours and confrontations with parents and choices made with open eyes. But it had arrived, and it had the solidity of things built slowly, with attention without shortcuts. Sheikh Mansour had invited the two for a formal dinner the previous week. It had been the first meal for the three of them together since the August meeting, and there was over the table an air of recalibration that none of the three had named, but all had felt. Mansour had asked about the literacy project with an interest that seemed, for the first time, genuine. He had asked about Nadia's work with a courtesy that was not paternalism. It had been a dinner that didn't resolve everything, because some things aren't resolved in one dinner, but it had been a different beginning from anything that had existed before. The afternoon following the call from the agency, Nadia called her mother. Soraya answered on the second ring, as always, and there was in her mother's first hello an affectionate anxiety that Nadia knew by heart. "Is everything okay?" asked the mother. "Everything is truly okay," said Nadia, not out of courtesy. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the pause of someone verifying if they believe what they heard. "You sound different," said Soraya. "I am the same." "No," said the mother, with the soft voice of someone who is not contradicting, but confirming. "You sound more whole." Nadia stayed with that word for a while after hanging up. Whole. It was the right word. Not complete, because no one is complete, but whole, which is different, which means that the parts that exist are all present and recognized and in the place where they belong. There was something she had discovered in those months in Rashara that she hadn't found in the years of deliberate construction of her own independence in Sao Paulo, that being truly seen by another person does not threaten one's own wholeness. It can, on the contrary, make it more visible even to oneself. And there was something Khalid had discovered too. She noticed in the small details of coexistence that there are forms of strength that do not appear in ministry reports or diplomatic negotiations, forms that exist in a person's ability to remain themselves within structures that were built to mold them in another way. He had seen that in her since the Paris corridor, had recognized it before naming it. And there was this mutual recognition between them that was, they discovered, a very particular form of intimacy. On a late September afternoon, when the Rashara sun had finally yielded enough for them to stay in the garden without the heat oppressing, Nadia was translating a water policy document when Khalid sat beside her and was silent for a moment, looking at the garden. "I have a proposal," he said. She raised her head from the document. "Another one?" His mouth moved. "A different one," he said. "For next year, when the political situation is more stable and the literacy project has completed the first phase of expansion, I would like to create an interpretation and cultural mediation unit linked to the program, aimed at facilitating dialogue between the village communities and the Emirates institutions. You would be the right person to lead that." She stood looking at him. "You are offering me a job." "I am offering you a project," he said. "That would use what you do best, and that would make sense here, but only if you want it, and only if life here is what you want it to be. Both things need to be true at the same time." She was silent for a moment. She looked at the garden, at the fountain, at the palms that the September wind moved with a lightness that July didn't allow. She thought of São Paulo, the fig tree in her parents' backyard, the smell of coffee in the kitchen, the corridors of Guarulhos airport full of voices in every language that exists. She thought of Paris, the corridor where a man had contested her translation and had begun, without knowing it, something that would take months to have a name. She thought that building a life is not the same as having a life, that both are necessary, but that there are moments when the construction and the life finally coincide, and in those moments it is necessary to recognize what is happening without letting it slip away through excess of caution or fear of wanting too much. "I'll think about it," she said, which was what she said when she was close to saying yes, but wanted to be sure the yes was complete. He nodded. He knew how to wait. And Nadia went back to the water policy document, and Khalid sat beside her in the garden with the tablet, and the September wind moved the palms of Rashara with the perfect lightness of things that have found the exact balance between what they were and what they are still becoming. There was between the two that afternoon the silence of those who don't need to fill the air to know they are in the same room, the silence of those who arrived here by paths neither had chosen, and who found within that path not the trap they feared, but something that only exists when two people decide, with open eyes, that it is worth staying. And in the garden of the Al-Rashid Palace, with the September breeze and the fountain at the center, and the lanterns that were beginning to light with the sunset, Nadia Khoury, daughter of a Lebanese family raised in the ABC region of São Paulo, interpreter of 3 languages and builder of bridges, finally allowed herself to feel what she had recognized weeks ago but had not yet said in any of the languages she knew, that she was, for the first time, exactly where she wanted to be. End of story. And so, dear listeners, we reach the end of the story of Nadia and Khalid, 2 worlds that collided in a Paris corridor and discovered, word by word, that the truest bridges are the ones we build without planning. If this story touched something inside you, if you stayed here until the end, then you know that the heart recognizes a good story even before the mind finishes processing it. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because every week we bring new stories with this same intensity, this same care for every detail, every character, every turn that takes your breath away. Leave your like, because it tells us that you were here and that the journey was worth it. And tell us in the comments, do you believe that 2 such different worlds can in fact build something real? We are waiting for you. Until the next story.